In October 2024, Daniel Carter drove 20 miles outside a small town in Oklahoma to an old farmhouse he had recently bought. The property had belonged to his uncle, Thomas Carter, who disappeared 8 years earlier. Nobody in town liked talking about what happened. The realtor had told Daniel the place had been empty ever since. That was exactly why he bought it. He wanted somewhere quiet. The farmhouse stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dead grass, open fields, and an old wooden fence that looked like it could collapse at any moment. Daniel parked his pickup near the porch and stepped outside. The wind was cold. There was no traffic, no nearby houses, just the sound of dry grass moving across the field. Then Daniel noticed something strange. They were fresh tire tracks in the dirt. They started near the main road and continued all the way to his property. He looked toward the gate. It was still locked. Daniel had locked it himself after arriving. He walked toward the front door. The padlock was untouched, but beneath it, in the dust, were fresh boot prints. Someone had been standing there recently. Daniel looked across the empty field. Nothing moved. He unlocked the house and went inside. The interior smelled of old wood and dust. Most of the furniture was still covered with white sheets. Daniel dropped his bags in the living room and started checking the rooms. At the end of the hallway, he found a small door, a basement. He opened it. A narrow wooden staircase disappeared into darkness. Daniel pointed his phone light downward. The steps were covered with dust, all except one. There was a fresh boot print on the fourth step. Daniel stared at it. Then a metallic sound came from below. Something had moved. He immediately shut the door. The next morning, Daniel met his closest neighbor. His name was Frank Miller. Frank was an older man who had lived in the area for more than 30 years. When he saw Daniel, he stopped beside the fence. "You're Thomas's nephew, aren't you?" Daniel nodded. Frank looked toward the farmhouse. "I heard someone finally bought the place." "I guess I'm the idiot who did it," Daniel joked. Frank didn't smile. Instead, he asked, "Did you sleep there last night?" "Yeah." Frank stared at him for a moment. Then he said, "If someone comes to your door after dark, don't open it unless you know exactly who it is." Daniel laughed. "Is there a crime problem around here?" Frank shook his head. "Not anymore." Before Daniel could ask what that meant, Frank walked back toward his truck. That afternoon, Daniel began cleaning the bedrooms. Inside an old closet, he found a cardboard box filled with his uncle's belongings. There were receipts, photographs, property documents, and several handwritten notes. At the bottom was an old county inspection report dated March 2016. The house had officially been declared vacant, but someone had written a sentence across the final page. "Do not trust anyone claiming to work for the county after dark." Daniel read it twice. He took a picture of the note, then he put everything back. That evening, the temperature dropped sharply. Daniel cooked dinner, locked the doors, and settled into the living room. Around midnight, headlights appeared through the curtains. A white pickup slowly entered the driveway. Daniel watched from behind the window. The truck stopped near the porch. Nobody got out. After nearly a minute, it backed away and disappeared down the road. Daniel checked the front gate. It was still locked. That bothered him. There was no reason for someone to drive onto private property in the middle of the night. He went back to bed. A little after midnight, 3 knocks came from the front door. Daniel sat upright. He listened. Nothing. Then came another knock. A man's voice followed. "Daniel?" His stomach tightened. The stranger knew his name. Daniel quietly walked toward the hallway. He didn't turn on the lights. "I'm a friend of Frank," the man said from outside. Daniel stayed silent. His phone was already in his hand. He called Frank. After several rings, the older man answered. "Daniel? Did you send someone here?" There was a long pause. Then Frank said something that made Daniel's blood run cold. "No." The voice outside spoke again. "Daniel, I just need to talk to you." Frank whispered through the phone. "Do not open that door." Daniel looked toward the entrance. "Why?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Because I haven't told anyone you're there." A few seconds later, something slid underneath the front door. An envelope. Daniel waited. The footsteps outside slowly disappeared. He remained still for almost a minute before picking it up. His full name was written across the front. Inside was an old photograph of the farmhouse. The picture appeared to have been taken years earlier. Daniel turned it over. A date was written on the back. October 14th, 2014. Underneath it was a single sentence. "Your uncle didn't leave this place willingly." Daniel stared at the words. His uncle had disappeared on October 14th, 2014.
He had always been told Thomas left town without telling anyone. Daniel suddenly wanted to know who had written that message. He searched through the box again. At the bottom, underneath several old newspapers, he found a small metal container. Inside was an old brass key and a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local farmer missing. Search suspended." Daniel read the article. The missing man's name was Thomas Carter, his uncle. Daniel's hands began to shake. He looked at the photograph again. This time he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Near the field behind the farmhouse, there was a man standing beside the fence. The image was blurry, but the jacket was unmistakable. Daniel had seen that same jacket earlier that night. The man outside his door had been wearing it. Daniel stepped away from the photograph. Then something moved outside the bedroom window. He froze. A shadow passed across the glass. Daniel slowly turned toward the window. Nobody was there. But on the outside of the glass was a fresh handprint. And beneath it, written through the dust, were 4 words. "You should have left." Daniel didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the living room with every interior door locked, listening to the wind move around the farmhouse. The handprint on the bedroom window bothered him more than the message. The window was almost 8 feet above the ground. There was no porch beneath it. No ladder stood nearby. Whoever had left that mark had been standing somewhere Daniel couldn't explain. At sunrise, he called Frank. Frank arrived 20 minutes later. Daniel showed him the photograph, the newspaper clipping, and the message on the window. Frank looked at everything without saying a word. Finally, Daniel asked, "You knew about this, didn't you?" Frank rubbed his forehead. "I knew something happened to your uncle." "What?" "I never knew the whole story." Daniel pointed toward the photograph. "Then tell me what you do know." Frank sat down. Thomas believed someone was using these farms for something illegal. Daniel frowned. What kind of illegal activity? Storage, vehicles, maybe stolen equipment. He wasn't sure. Why didn't he call the police? He did. Frank looked toward the window. That was the problem. According to Frank, Thomas had contacted the county sheriff several times during the months before he disappeared. He claimed vehicles were entering farms at night through private roads. He also said strangers were pretending to be county workers. Every time officers checked the property, they found nothing. Eventually, people started thinking Thomas was paranoid. Daniel looked at the old report. So nobody believed him.
Frank shook his head. Not until after he vanished. Daniel asked what happened after the disappearance. Frank hesitated. 3 days later, his pickup was found near an abandoned grain elevator. Was Thomas inside? No. Any evidence? Nothing. Daniel looked down at the floor. Then why did everyone assume he left? Frank gave him a tired look. Because that was easier than admitting someone might have taken him. A sudden noise came from the hallway. Both men turned. The basement door was open. Daniel was certain he had closed it. Frank stood up. Did you go down there? No. They walked toward the stairs. The fresh boot print Daniel had seen the previous day was still there. But now there were several more. They continued down into the basement. At the bottom was an old workbench. Beside it sat a rusted metal cabinet. Daniel tried the brass key from the box. It fit. Inside were dozens of photographs. Most showed trucks parked beside farms throughout the county. Several pictures showed men unloading large wooden crates. Daniel recognized one location immediately: the abandoned grain elevator where his uncle's truck had been found. Frank stared at the photographs. Thomas took these. Daniel found another envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the area. Several properties had been marked with red circles. His farmhouse was one of them. At the bottom of the page, Thomas had written, "They aren't using the farms anymore." Daniel looked confused. What does that mean? Frank pointed to another sentence. "They are using the roads underneath them." Daniel looked at him. What roads? Frank didn't know. Before they could continue, Daniel heard an engine outside. Both men climbed the stairs. A dark SUV was parked near the fence. No license plate was visible from that distance. Frank immediately stepped away from the window. That's not a local vehicle. The SUV remained there for several minutes, then it drove away. Daniel grabbed his phone. "I got the plate on camera." Frank shook his head. "Don't call anyone yet." "Why?" "Because you don't know who you're calling." That sentence stayed with Daniel all afternoon. He spent hours studying the photographs. One picture showed a narrow dirt road behind his farmhouse. At first, it looked ordinary. Then Daniel noticed a small concrete structure hidden behind tall grass. He had never seen it while walking the property. He took the photograph outside. The structure was still there. Daniel walked toward it. It was an old utility building with a steel door. The lock had been cut recently. Inside, there were no machines, no electricity, only a set of wooden stairs leading underground. Daniel stopped. He called Frank. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. Daniel decided to go back to the house. As he turned around, he heard a vehicle approaching. He crouched behind the structure. The same dark SUV from earlier drove slowly past the property. 2 men were inside. Daniel stayed hidden until they disappeared. Then he noticed something on the ground. A cigarette. It was still warm. Someone had been standing there moments before. Daniel returned to the farmhouse and locked every door. He searched online for information about the abandoned grain elevator. Most records were old, but one local newspaper article caught his attention. The article mentioned several missing pieces of agricultural equipment from nearby counties. There was also a strange detail. The disappearances happened along the same rural roads marked on Thomas's map. Daniel looked at the map again. A pattern began to emerge. The marked properties formed a rough circle. His farmhouse was almost exactly in the center. That evening, Frank finally called. His voice sounded different. "Daniel, where are you?" Home? Listen carefully. I found something. What? Your uncle had a second notebook. Where? I know where he kept it. Daniel stood up. Where? Frank lowered his voice. Under the old church outside town. Before Daniel could ask anything else, the call ended. Daniel tried calling back. Nothing. He waited 10 minutes, then 20. Finally, a vehicle stopped outside. Daniel looked through the curtain. It wasn't the dark SUV. It was Frank's truck. But Frank wasn't inside. The driver's door was open. Daniel stepped onto the porch. He shouted Frank's name. No response. Then he noticed something attached to the windshield. A photograph. Daniel walked closer. It showed Frank standing beside Thomas Carter. Both men were much younger. On the back was a handwritten message. He told you to check the church. Daniel stared at the words. Then he looked toward the road. A second vehicle was parked far away near the trees. Its headlights were off. Someone was watching the farmhouse. Daniel went back inside. He grabbed Thomas's map, the brass key, and his phone. He knew he shouldn't go anywhere alone. But if Frank had been taken because of something connected to his uncle, waiting wasn't going to make things safer. Daniel locked the farmhouse behind him. Before leaving, he looked once toward the basement door. It was open again, and this time, there was a fresh trail of muddy footprints leading from the stairs straight toward his bedroom.
Daniel drove toward the old church outside town, with Thomas's map lying on the passenger seat. The road was nearly empty. He kept checking the rearview mirror. For several miles, nothing followed him. Then a pair of headlights appeared behind his pickup, the same dark SUV. Daniel didn't speed up. Instead, he turned onto a gas station near the highway. The SUV continued past without stopping. Daniel waited until it disappeared before leaving again. The church was abandoned. Its windows were boarded up, and weeds had grown across the entrance. Daniel walked around the back. Behind the building was a small cemetery. Thomas's map showed a circle around one particular grave. Daniel found it after several minutes. The name on the stone was unfamiliar, but beneath the name was a small metal plate. Daniel used the brass key. The plate opened. Inside was a waterproof notebook. Thomas's handwriting covered almost every page. Daniel began reading. Thomas had discovered that several farms in the area shared an old underground drainage system. Years earlier, farmers had used it to move water between properties. After the system was abandoned, some of the tunnels remained. Someone had discovered them. The tunnels were being used to move stolen agricultural equipment and other goods without being seen from the roads. Thomas had photographed the operation. He had also discovered something worse. Someone inside the local system was warning the criminals whenever law enforcement became involved. Daniel turned another page. One sentence made him stop. Frank knows more than he's telling me. Daniel's heart sank. He kept reading. Thomas explained that he had confronted Frank shortly before disappearing. Frank admitted he had once helped transport equipment through the underground passages, but he claimed he stopped years earlier. Thomas didn't believe him. The final page contained only one line. "If I disappear, don't trust the man who says he is helping you." Daniel immediately thought of Frank. Then he heard footsteps behind the church. He closed the notebook. A voice called out, "Daniel?" It was Frank. Daniel turned. Frank stood several yards away. His clothes were dirty, and there was a cut on his forehead.
Daniel stepped backward. "Where were you?" Frank looked exhausted. "I was taken." "By who?" "I don't know." Daniel held up the notebook. "You knew about the tunnels." Frank's expression changed. "Yes." "You helped them." Frank looked down. "A long time ago." Daniel tightened his grip on the notebook. "My uncle knew." "I know." "Did you have anything to do with his disappearance?" Frank immediately shook his head. "No." Daniel didn't move. Frank continued. "Thomas found the operation. He wanted to expose everyone involved. I tried to convince him to leave it alone." "Why?" "Because one of the people involved was my brother." Daniel stared at him. Frank explained that his brother had worked for a regional farm equipment company. He had access to transportation records and knew which properties were empty. That information made the illegal operation possible. Thomas had discovered the connection. Before he could report it, he disappeared. Daniel asked the question that had been bothering him since the beginning. "Then who has been coming to my farmhouse?" Frank looked toward the cemetery. "The people who are still using the tunnels." Daniel showed him the photograph of the man outside the farmhouse. Frank studied it. Then his face went pale. "I know him." "Who is he?" Frank didn't answer. A vehicle suddenly appeared at the end of the road. The dark SUV. Frank grabbed Daniel's arm. "We need to leave." They ran toward Daniel's pickup. The SUV stopped near the church. Two men stepped out. Frank and Daniel reached the truck and drove away. The chase lasted several miles. Daniel eventually turned onto a narrow farm road and killed the headlights. They waited in silence. The SUV passed the entrance without seeing them. Frank finally spoke. "That man in the photograph is my brother's son." Daniel looked at him. "Your nephew?" Frank nodded. "He took over after his father died." Daniel remembered the jacket. The same one from the photograph. The same one worn by the man outside his farmhouse.
They returned to the property after sunrise. Frank told Daniel to leave immediately, but Daniel refused. He wanted proof. Together, they entered the basement. Thomas's map showed a hidden entrance beneath the old workbench. After moving several heavy boards, they discovered a narrow concrete passage. The tunnel smelled of damp soil. They followed it for several minutes. Eventually, they reached a larger underground room. Inside were stolen farm machines, tools, documents, and vehicle plates. Daniel photographed everything. Then he noticed something on a wooden table. An old cassette recorder. Thomas's name was written on it. Frank found a battery-powered player nearby. They listened. Thomas's voice came through the speaker. He explained everything he had discovered. He also named the people involved. Frank's brother was one of them. But Thomas never accused Frank. Instead, he said Frank had tried to help him. The recording ended with Thomas saying that he planned to meet someone at the church. Daniel looked at Frank. "That's where he disappeared." Frank nodded. They left the tunnel and contacted state investigators from outside the county. This time, Daniel didn't call the local sheriff. The evidence was enough. Within weeks, several people were arrested. The underground storage operation was shut down. Thomas's disappearance was reopened as a criminal investigation. Months later, Daniel decided to sell the farmhouse. Before leaving for good, he went through the house one final time. The basement had been sealed. The property was quiet, almost peaceful. Daniel packed the last box into his truck.
Then he noticed something inside the old bedroom closet, a small envelope. He opened it. Inside was another photograph. This one showed Thomas standing in front of the farmhouse. On the back was a date, October 13th, 2014, one day before Thomas disappeared. Daniel looked closely at the picture. Thomas wasn't alone. Frank was standing beside him, and between them was another man. The same man from the photograph Daniel had received on his first night. Daniel recognized him immediately. Frank's nephew. But there was one problem. The photograph had been taken in 2014. Frank's nephew was only 12 years old that year. Daniel turned the photograph over again. Below the date, Thomas had written, "That's not him." Daniel froze. He looked toward the empty farmhouse. For the first time, he understood what Thomas had been trying to tell him. The man Daniel saw outside the house wasn't wearing an old jacket because it belonged to Frank's nephew. He was wearing it because the jacket had belonged to Thomas. And whoever had been watching Daniel from the beginning had known exactly where Thomas kept his photographs. Daniel drove away from the property without looking back. The farmhouse was eventually demolished. The tunnels were sealed. The investigation continued for years. Thomas was never found. But Daniel kept one photograph, the picture taken on October 13th, 2014, because there was one detail investigators could never explain. In the background, near the farmhouse window, stood a man wearing Thomas Carter's jacket. And nobody in the Carter family remembered seeing him that day.